The world is on a knife edge. There's over 100 armed conflicts currently taking place right across the globe. Some of these are new, others have been going on for decades. But each episode will break down everything you need to know to understand the battles shaping the world today. Welcome to the War Zone. I'm Maddie Hale. More than 850 days later, Russia and Ukraine are still locked in a war. A war that sees Russia continually and aggressively push its way into Ukraine, aiming to occupy the country as the Ukrainian army defends itself with all they have. Last month, it looked like Putin's army were well on their way to capturing Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, but the country seems to have held its own. The aftermath, if Russia were to win this war, would be catastrophic, not just for Ukraine, but for the rest of the world, making it clear that NATO needs to protect Ukraine at all costs. But perhaps Ukraine may soon get the upper hand with the emergence of not just military aid from the United States, but a particular tank from Germany. Joining me now to discuss this is former British Colonel Hamish to Bretton-Gordon. Hamish, thank you so much for your time today. Now, you've pointed out that Germany aren't far off from sending a new tank, the Frankenstein tank, to Ukraine, its fight against Russia. Can you walk me through exactly what this tank is and how it's different to the ones the Ukrainian military are already using?
Sure. Thanks very much for having me on. This is a new piece of kit, and on the face of it, we've talked about tanks an awful lot in this war. The fact that these beasts that are over 110 years old from conception, that really changed the face of the First World War, are still having such an impact, 110 years later in Ukraine. But what has also emerged in this war is the drone war. These tiny little drones, $500 a piece, thousands, if not millions of them, flying around, dropping hand grenades into tank hatches and really making a huge difference. And the challenge is how with a force that was designed before drones became a thing, how that you actually defend against them. And lots of novel approaches have been looked at, from putting metal cages on top of tanks and vehicles, using lasers to try and disrupt these drones, and also just firing lots of ammunition at them. So this latest German tank, which is a sort of evolution of their current Leopard tanks, the idea is that they'll use the Leopard 1 hulls, the oldest German tanks, which they have an awful lot of, and are putting in effect an anti-aircraft gun, a 35mm Sky Ranger gun. And this is a gun that fires thousands of rounds of ammunition and is designed to be able to take down these drones at low cost. Hitherto, the Ukrainians have had to use expensive anti-aircraft missiles to take down these drones, and they've run out of it, as we know. So this seems a really novel and clever way of bridging this gap, because these Frankenstein tanks, as they're called, could take thousands of drones out of the air, and it's repurposing a tank that already exists. I think the other interesting thing is that it's using a 35mm cannon, and many people have seen, and we've talked before, a very similar weapon, very similar gun is on the Bradley armored fighting vehicle, which is the American infantry troop carrier, but also has this gun on, which has been hugely effective. And we've described how this 35mm cannon has also taken out some of the most elite Russian sort of T-90 tanks. So not only does this Frankenstein tank appear to answer, the question of how you deal with thousands and thousands of drones, but also it has the potential to be used against Russian armored vehicles. And because there are so many of these Leopard 1 tank hulls around, and also a lot of the Sky Ranger guns, many of these vehicles can be adapted, and we understand that they're going to be on the front line very soon. The challenges of some of the laser weapons that have been designed to shoot down these drones is that, although they work, they're not going to be available in numbers for years. But this Frankenstein tank will be there very soon and should make a significant difference.
So it's obviously the more efficient and cost-effective piece of artillery weaponry in this incredibly expensive war that so many countries have had to fund Ukraine to, get them protecting their own country. But you said that it will be there shortly. But is there a time frame you think, Hamish, where it could get there? And how many are there actually of these Frankenstein tanks that can be immediately sent to Ukraine?
Well, it's difficult to tell, and I don't think that the German government have said that. But we have seen the tank. I mean, it exists. It is just a question of taking the turret of the Sky Ranger gun and putting it on top of a Leopard 1 tank hull. The Germans will have a lot of both. So one would imagine that they could put, tens, if not hundreds of these vehicles to the front line. Now, how quickly they're going to be there, I mean, because this war is moving so quickly, the fact that the German government have said that they're available and will be going to the front line, one would expect to see them on the front line in weeks, if not, if not days, rather than months. So one would hope very quickly, because we know that the summer is going to be critical. We've seen the big fights around Kharkiv, which we'll cover in a minute, but a lot of people, and me as well, other military analysts, believe the main push is going to be further south, and that is where they again need these anti-aircraft tanks in numbers to make sure that they can hold the Russians there.
So the Frankenstein tanks are quite detrimental to this fight at Kharkiv. Yeah, we'll get straight into that. The second largest city in Ukraine, and it's the one city that the Russian army trying so hard to occupy, and it seems like the Ukrainian army they've held off. We thought 1 month ago that they would have taken it by now, but it seems the Ukrainian army have done a good enough job to be able to block them from entering, but they aren't far off the area. So if the Frankenstein tanks were to get there in the next few weeks, would it be a huge advantage for the Ukrainian army?
I think it'll be a huge advantage whether they get to. I mean, Kharkiv is absolutely pivotal to all of this. As you said, it's the second city. It's very close to the Russian border. And if the Russians could take it, it would be a huge morale boost for them. And conversely, bad for the morale for the Ukrainians, which is why Ukraine has redeployed a number of brigades to make sure it doesn't happen. And also, the Russians have taken unbelievable amounts of casualties. We're talking 1,000 dead every day over the last few months. I mean, it is just unimaginable. I mean, yesterday we saw a report, the UK Ministry of Defence intelligence update yesterday said that the Russians had 150,000 prisoners on the front line, 40% of which had already been killed. But it is just an industrial scale. But we think that the Russian attack in Kharkiv was a feint to try and draw these forces away. And it would appear that the main thrust is coming up from further south in the Donbass, where a lot of Russian troops have been building up. So it is probably there where these Frankenstein tanks should be directed, because it would appear that the Ukrainians have now held Kharkiv. And now that the Ukrainians have permission from the Americans to fire up to 400 kilometers into Russia with some of the sophisticated weaponry like the ATACMS and the HIMARS precision missiles, actually, the Ukrainians are getting slightly on the front foot now. And it would appear the Russians are not making progress in the northeast of Ukraine. And one would expect them now to focus back down into the Donbass, where they might have an advantage. So if I was directing these Frankenstein tanks and other key equipments, it would probably be down to the Donbass rather than the Kharkiv area.
So, Hamish, do you think the Putin's army are close to Kharkiv or are now at a standstill because they haven't made those inroads yet? Or do you think it was more of a distraction to be targeting the Kharkiv area, but in actuality, the Russian army were moving more south towards Donbass, as you've said?
Absolutely. In military terms, we call it a feint. In other words, a bit like a boxer doing a sort of dummy punch to try and get the Ukrainians off balance. It would seem, and to have a feint to be effective, you need to put troops behind it, and there needs to be reason to it. So one can see why the Russians might want to take Kharkiv, but actually, And I'm sure if they had managed to take Kharkiv, they would have reinforced that feint. But they've been very much held now and pushed back, taken unbelievable amounts of casualties. And the focus is very much back to the Donbass, where the analysis, which I agree with, is that is where the main thrust is going to be this summer. And that's where Ukraine needs to focus. But at least now that they're getting the ammunition from the Americans that has been so badly missed over the last 6 months, they've also got the ability to fire deep into Russia. And we've seen some of their attacks into Crimea over the last few days having a huge impact on the command and control systems there. So, yeah, I think from a few months ago, we were really concerned that Kharkiv would fall and the Russians were making definitive progress. But now it would appear actually, Ukraine is just getting the advantage. And hopefully, as long as the weaponry keeps coming through, and let's not forget the F-16 fighter jets are just over the horizon, that actually Ukraine might be able to start making some progress rather than falling back as they have been for the last 6 months or so.
So you just mentioned this, Hamish, but obviously the weaponry that Ukraine had been missing from the US, they hadn't had any in months and months. I think from November they hadn't received anything. They're now receiving the weaponry from the United States, and the US has now permitted Ukraine, as you said, to use this Western artillery and rockets to defend Kharkiv, which seems to have actually bought Ukraine some more time. How successful has this advantage been for Ukraine?
Well, I think it's been crucial. Without the ability to strike into Russia, it's likely that Kharkiv might well have fallen because, in effect, Ukraine's been fighting with one hand tied behind its back, not being able to attack the Russians until they're actually in Ukraine. Whereas, of course, all their command and control headquarters, their airfields, where their troops mass, is all in Russia. Now they've been able to attack those and what we call the lines of communication, where all the ammunition comes from. It's really blunted Russia's attack in that area. And the focus for what we call the deep battle, in other words, fighting behind the front lines, is now very much in the Donbass and down into Crimea. So, yeah, it's been crucial. What is a great shame is that they haven't been able to do this all war. Well, had they been, it might have been a different story.
Well, on that note, Hamish, most people know that the United States is providing Ukraine with military humanitarian aid. This has been going on since the war started in February 22. They're the highest donor to Ukraine, but not a lot of people would know that with this money, with this aid, comes restrictions on what they can use and where it can be used. Why had the Biden administration implemented this policy that Ukraine weren't allowed to strike into Russian territory until the Russian army had moved into Ukrainian territory?
I think the key thing behind it is the Americans and ourselves and NATO want to avoid escalation. If NATO weapons, US weapons have been used to strike Russia, as Putin and the other gangsters in the Kremlin say, that is now NATO fighting Russia, and Russia is using that excuse to threaten us with nuclear weapons, virtually on a daily basis. And all the way along, I think, from the very start of the war, people have been very conscious not to try and expand it into World War III or war in Europe. And I think politicians are very cautious, and one can appreciate that. But I think people have seen now that actually the war hasn't, it's over 2.5 years now. It hasn't extended, hasn't escalated. Putin hasn't used his nuclear weapons. So we have always been trying to give Ukraine the wherewithal to defeat the Russians themselves. And now the view taken is that actually the best way to do that is to allow the Ukrainians to strike into Russia, which they're now doing. And as we've seen, that has not elicited a nuclear weapon heading towards Europe or the UK or anywhere else. And it hasn't escalated and spread the war. Fundamentally, Putin does not want that. He absolutely knows that militarily NATO overmatches the Russians by sort of 10-1. So he knows if he gets into a fight with NATO, he's completely finished. And now we heard about his ceasefire the other day, which was a bit ridiculous. We gather some of Trump's advisors are now suggesting that they might push for a ceasefire if Trump gets in later in the year. And I think Putin is looking probably for a way out. So, yeah, this is the time to really keep supporting Ukraine to the hilt.
Well, just finally, Hamish, on that note, Trump's advisors say that Ukraine needs to push for peace talks. If Trump were to be brought back in for another term in the November 2024 presidential election, that's a huge call to be making, to be saying that Ukraine are the ones that need to be pushing for peace talks with Russia. What did you make of a comment like that, and what does that kind of indicate to you if Trump were to win this election?
Well, I think from a military strategic position, it's really unhelpful. The last thing you need to do is to, give your enemy too much information. Tell them what you're going to do, because then they can react to it. And if Putin thinks that come November, Trump is going to insist on negotiations and stop the flow of weapons, then for Putin, he's thinking, right, if I can hold on where I am till then, I've got what I want to achieve. I mean, his peace deal has basically stopping where we are now, demilitarizing Ukraine, and those 4 oblasts, which the Russians are illegally holding at the moment, become part of Russia. So, Putin probably thinks, hang on to November and I'll get exactly that. So it is very, very unhelpful. And which is why it makes the next 3 or 4 months so absolutely crucial that, if Trump does get in and insists on a ceasefire negotiations at the end of the year, then Ukraine is in a very much better position than it is at the moment.
Hamish, Bretton-Gordon, thank you so much for your time today.